So in the first video in this series, I talked a little bit about Hillary Clinton. I talked about what she put on her website as far as what she feels the issues are. And so I'm going to continue this. And in this episode, we're going to talk about her primary competition on the Democratic side, which is, of course, Bernie Sanders. And so I'm going to look at his website, see what he has to say, and then I can only give you my opinion. Okay, so before we get into the BernieSanders.com, I wanted to address one thing real quick. Some people have expressed concern in the length of these political videos, and yes, they're going to be on the longer side for this series. The Hillary Clinton video was 50 minutes long, and believe me, that was a long day of recording and going through every aspect of her website. And Bernie Sanders' website looks to be even more in depth than Hillary's. I don't know if he's got any details, and I'm going to summarize each section as succinctly as I can, but I think it's important to cover all the bases here. I think that the problem with a lot of our election cycles is that we don't really know what the candidates stand for. We just hear sound bites here, sound bites there, or somebody else's opinion of them, usually an over-exaggeration of their faults. And so I don't want to be that kind of a person. I don't want to pass on information that is false or incomplete about these candidates. I wanted to give you the full picture of what Hillary said, which I think I did. Yes, I editorialized a little bit, but I gave you all the points that she put in her website on the issues. I'm going to do the same for Bernie Sanders and every other candidate. Hopefully, I won't get quite as frustrated with Mr. Sanders as I did with Mrs. Clinton, but we shall see. Now, his website is actually broken down into a few categories here. Income and wealth, these are the issues on his website. Income and wealth inequality, getting big money out of politics, creating decent paying jobs, racial justice, fighting for women's rights, a fair and humane immigration policy, a living wage, real family values, climate change and environment, and reforming Wall Street. I have not looked at these yet. I'm going to start with income and wealth inequality. I'm going to stop the recording, read what he has to say, and let's find out what he has to say on that topic. Okay, so just finished looking over the income and wealth inequality section of his website, and I have to say that in some ways Mr. Sanders' site is the exact opposite of what Hillary Clinton's is. Where Hillary Clinton, I kept getting frustrated over and over and over and that there's no details. Bernie Sanders, boy, does he get into the details here and very, very specific stuff. And I appreciate that, by the way. Even when I disagree with it, at least I can appreciate that he's got the information here. So at first, I thought I was going to be looking at the same thing I saw with Hillary, because these first few sections are just basically talking about the typical talking points of what the problem is, that the rich have too much money, that that 58% of all new income since Wall Street crash goes to the top 1%, stuff like that. Okay, we've heard this before and on the campaign trail, particularly from Democrats. And okay, that's fine. That's the problem. I don't want to hear all day long just what the problem is. I want to hear what your solution is. And that's where Bernie Sanders, man, I got to give this guy credit. He really nails down what he wants to do here. And so he has 13 points that are very specific. Notice this last section starts out, as president, Senator Bernie Sanders will reduce income and wealth inequality by, and then he lists what he wants to do. And so I'm going to go through it. It's going to take a few minutes, but I think it's worth it because this guy, like I said, he's got a plan, which is more than I can say for Secretary Clinton. Number one, demanding that wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share in taxes. And so now here I will nitpick a little bit in that he doesn't really say how much he wants is their fair share. He does say he wants to create a progressive estate tax on people that inherit large sums of money. but again, not very specific on this point. Number 2, increasing the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour by 2020. Again, something that I was kind of frustrated with Hillary. Hillary's sites mentioned a few times that she wanted to raise the minimum wage. She never said to what. Here, Bernie actually says, this is what it's going to be. This is when it's going to be. So thank you for putting that out there. Number 3, putting at least 13 million Americans to work by investing $1 trillion over 5 years, rebuilding our crumbling roads, bridges, railways, airports, public transport systems, ports, dams, wastewater plants, and other infrastructure needs. Again, it's fairly specific, although I'm not sure how he intends to pay for it, unless by making these large corporations pay their quote-unquote fair share. But he doesn't really say what that fair share is. So he's saying specifically what he wants to do, but not as much information on how he wants to do it here. Number 4, reversing trade policies like NAFTA, CAFTA, PNTR, I'm not sure which one that is, with China that have driven down wages and caused the loss of millions of jobs. Okay, specific pieces of treaties or trade policies that he wants to get rid of. I'm with you there. I'm not endorsing, I'm just saying I understand what he wants to do. Number 5, creating 1 million jobs for disadvantaged young Americans by investing $5.5 billion in youth jobs program. Okay, again, pretty specific. $5.5 billion on our government standards. Not an incredibly huge sum of money, but still nothing here as to how he's going to pay for it. Number 6, fighting for pay equity by signing the Paycheck Fairness Act into law. That's one that he and Secretary Clinton have in common. She mentioned the Paycheck Fairness Act on hers as well, that she would encourage that it should be passed. I haven't researched the Paycheck Fairness Act, so I don't know the details of it. But at least it's a specific point. Okay, you want that particular bill to pass. Number 7, making tuition free at public colleges and universities throughout America. Everyone in this country who studies hard should be able to go to college. That's a big one. I think that, I think that's one of the reasons that Bernie Sanders is doing so well in the polls with young people. Thinking back to back in my day, back in the 1980s, when the first time I was able to vote for president, I voted for Dukakis over George H.W. Bush. And one of the primary reasons I voted for Dukakis was because he wanted to do something very much like this. He wanted college education to be free for people. And I think his plan was something like, if you go to college and then you agree to do like 2 years of public service, then your tuitions would be free. But the problem here again is, once again, that's a great idea to make college free. And by the way, I agree with that, but there's a couple of things here. Number 1, public colleges and universities are operated by the states, not by the federal government. So I don't know how he plans on doing this. Number 2, again, and this seems to be unfortunately a theme with Mr. Sanders, how is he going to pay for that? Where's the money going to come from? Number 8, expanding Social Security by lifting the cap on taxable income above $250,000. I completely agree with that. I think that Social Security tax right now is people talk about progressive taxes. Social Security is a regressive tax, because why should you become exempt from Social Security tax once you earn a certain level of income? The answer is you shouldn't. If you're going to tax everybody for as a retirement supplement for everybody, then you should tax everybody on all their income, not just people who make below a certain threshold. Number 9, guaranteeing health care as a right of citizenship by enacting the Medicare for All single-payer health care system. Excuse me. It's time for the U.S. to join every major industrialized country on Earth and provide universal health care. I'm not going to say I agree with it, but I do think it would work better than Obamacare, to be honest. So, but once again, he's running into this huge brick wall for me. How is he going to pay? These are huge expenditures, huge, unprecedented. I mean, he actually lists a $1 trillion expenditure earlier in this thing. Medicare for all, that's going to cost well over $1 trillion. I don't know how he's intending to do this. Now, granted, he is a socialist, and I'm not saying that as an insulting term. He's a self-declared socialist, but I still want to see financially how that's going to work. Number 10, requiring employers to provide at least 12 weeks of paid family medical leave, 2 weeks of paid vacation, 7 days of paid sick days. Okay, so that's not there's no expenditure there. You're just going to make that a requirement on businesses, whether you agree or disagree with that. And now, it doesn't say that there would be any exemptions, so I assume that small businesses that only have a couple of employees would still have to do this, and I don't know if there's any kind of subsidy for them, or if he's going to basically, say that that's just an expense of doing business in this country. So, let's see, what do we got next? Enacting universal child care and pre-kindergarten program. Every psychologist understands the most formative years is 0 to 4. Again, universal child care and pre-K program sounds nice when you say it, but how are you going to pay for this? That's going to be another $1 trillion or so. I mean, you're not talking about small programs here. You're talking about huge, fundamental changes. Number 12, make it easier for workers to join unions by fighting for the Employee Free Choice Act. Another piece of legislation I don't know the details of, but okay, so he's pro-union, and I guess there's a proposed piece of legislation out on it that he wants passed. Fair enough. Number 13, breaking up huge financial institutions so they're no longer too big to fail. 7 years ago, taxpayers, because country bailed out Wall Street because it's too big to fail. So basically, and I know I said I wasn't going to bring in sound bites and stuff, but I heard a sound bite of him saying too big to exist. Personally, I don't know that the federal government should be making that call, but at the same time, at least he's saying what he wants to do. He's not hiding behind anything. So that is, in a nutshell, his income and wealth inequality plank of his platform. So let's move on to the next part. All right, so his second plank is getting the big money out of politics. And here it is much, much less information than before, although it's a very simple topic, at least according to Bernie Sanders. Pretty much, he starts out with a little bit of a tirade about how he feels the big money shouldn't be in politics. That's what the bulk of this page is. Then down at the bottom where it says key actions, he says he introduced the Democracy is for People constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court Citizens United decision. Okay, so I guess that's something he's already done, and I gave my opinion on this in the last video, but I don't think a constitutional amendment is going to work. Number 2, voted for the Disclose Act to shine light on exorbitant amounts of dark money in our policies. That's something he did in the past. That doesn't tell me how he's going to do this in the future. And then number 3, promise that any Sanders administration Supreme Court nominee will commit to overturning the disastrous Citizens United decision. And once again, and I know that there are a lot of people that disagree with me on this, but I don't like the over-politicization of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices should not be appointed based on how they might rule on one ideological point or another, whether that be Roe v. Wade or, in this case, Citizens United. I don't think that should be any kind of test to whether or not someone will make a good Supreme Court justice. A good Supreme Court justice is someone who sticks to and adheres to the Constitution of the United States, period. But that's my opinion. I'm sorry that I got into that, but that's this is the second candidate that specifically wants Supreme Court justices just to undo prior Supreme Court decisions, and I don't know. I just have a problem with that. Anyway, So that's it for the getting big money out of politics. So now let's move on. Okay, so the creating decent paying jobs section of his website is very much like the last one, where it's very brief, not a whole lot here. And again, his key actions is really the only meat of it, and once again focuses on stuff he's done in the past. Of the three, all three of them, in fact. The first one is that he introduced legislation which would invest $1 trillion over 5 years, which he already said was part of his the first plank I talked about. Opposed NAFTA, CAFTA, etc., which he already mentioned, and introduced the Employee Young Americans Now Act that would do the 5.5 billion. So basically, and unfortunately for me, this kind of undermines that first incredibly rich and detailed section of his website, because basically he's saying that a lot of the stuff that is part of his plan of action is stuff he's already done, or at least already attempted to do. So honestly, no new information here. Okay, so the next section of his website is on racial justice, and for those of you that know me, you know this is one that is very near and dear to my heart, because I care very much about the issue of racism in this country, and I get endlessly frustrated by those that deny that racism is still a major problem in this country. That being said, I'm mixed on what Bernie Sanders has to say here. Primarily because he has a lot of bullet points, more bullet points than in the first section, but less detail. In fact, almost none. It just basically sounds like very rhetoric, things we'd like to do, not necessarily a plan of action. And so we'll get into it right here. I'm going to skip over, his descriptions of the problem. I don't think we need to do that, just as I did with Mrs. Clinton. But instead, we're going to just focus on what he said, the bullet points, which are the steps that need to, these are the things that need to happen. So, number one, we must demilitarize our police forces so they don't look and act like invading armies. And, first of all, I think it's funny, this parallels something that was on Hillary Clinton's site, where she said that we shouldn't be buying our police weapons of war. I was in the Army. And I don't understand people that think that our police forces look and act like invading armies, because if they really believe that, they have no idea what an invading army looks and acts like. But it also has no plan as to how he wants to do this. I mean, what do you want to give them all tie-dyed T-shirts and rubber band guns? I don't understand what you want to do here. Next, we must invest in community policing. Okay, I have no problem with that, but again, is the federal government going to simply hand money to every city in this country? If so, where are you going to get that money? We need police forces that reflect the diversity of our communities. So are you suggesting racial quotas for hiring? You should be, quite frankly, because Bernie Sanders seems to be quite blunt on several topics that may not be considered PC. If that's what you want, just say it. At the federal level, we need to establish a new model police training program that reorients the way we do law enforcement in this country. Okay, yeah, we do need better training for our police. Police don't have good enough. If you compare the training of a police officer to the training of, say, someone in the U.S. military, the U.S. military has way better training, and granted, nobody's going to be perfect, but the police training in this country really could use an overhaul. Not just, learn to be nicer, but effective use of force. When it, we should restructure that. I agree with that point. We need to federally fund and require body cameras for local law enforcement, or for law enforcement officers, to make it easier to hold them accountable. Hillary Clinton said that as well, but once again, there's nothing here as to how you're going to do this. Our Justice Department must aggressively investigate and prosecute police officers who break the law. Is it a federal crime? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Is that something for the federal government to do every time a cop supposedly breaks the law? Is it up to the federal government to step in? We need to require police departments and states to provide public reports on all police shootings and deaths that take place in police custody. That's going to create an entirely new bureaucracy, and again, there's no plan here. It just says we need to do this. You're going to give all the information to one guy? How are you going to do that? We need new rules on the allowable use of force. Police officers need to be trained to de-escalate confrontations and to humanely interact with people who have mental illness. I don't know necessarily new rules, because here's the problem. The rules on use of force are not 100% consistent throughout the 50 states, number one. And so to say we need new rules on it, well, are you suggesting that the federal government should then hand down police policy for every police force? If you do, fine, say it, but I think that would be the federal government overstepping its bounds. And I agree that this goes back to the training point. I think that police, it's not necessarily the rules of use of force as much as the training for officers to use proper force given the situation. States and localities that make progress in this area should get more federal justice grant money. Those that do not should get their funding slashed. So basically what you're saying is, from my understanding here, is that, okay, all the stuff that we've talked about, that there's no way to pay for it, well, it's up to the individual groups to do it, and if they do, we'll give you a little extra cash, but if you don't, we're going to starve you. I wholeheartedly disagree with that type of policy. I know it's something that both parties do, but I totally disagree with that kind of thing. We need to make sure the federal resources are there to crack down on illegal activities of hate groups. Okay. So how are you going to make sure of that? You've already spent trillions of dollars. How are you going to make sure more resources are available for taking care of hate groups specifically? Okay, so then let's go on to the next section, which is political violence. We need to re-enfranchise the more than 2 million African Americans who have had their right to vote taken away by a felony conviction. Currently, if you are a convicted felon, you are no longer have the privilege of voting in this country. And what he's basically saying is that should not be the case. However, he specifically says 2 million African Americans. I assume, Mr. Sanders, that you mean that you want every convicted felon to be able to vote, because if you're only talking about black convicted felons, then that, sir, is not going to solve anything, and in fact that'll just piss off a lot of people. And I don't know, I'm mixed on it. There's a reason that convicted felons lost their right to vote. Granted, some of those felonies may seem like, to one person or another, may seem trivial, but at the same time, okay, if you want to do that, you need to be clear about that. You're saying being convicted of a felony no longer strips you of your right to vote. Congress must restore the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance provision, which extends protections to minority votes in states where they are clearly needed. I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about here, to be honest, so I'll move on. We must expand the Act's scope so that every American, regardless of skin color or national origin, is able to vote freely. Who is not allowed to vote? That's a citizen. Honestly, okay, convicted felons, but who right now is legally not allowed to vote? Because it sounds like we have millions of people that are legally not allowed to vote. We need to make Election Day a federal holiday to increase voters' ability to participate. I kind of agree with that, although the problem is that making it a federal holiday just means federal employees. What you need to do is figure out a way. I actually liked Hillary Clinton's idea of having the voting take place over a 20-day period. But if, to make it a federal holiday is a step in the right direction, but then I think you need all the states to do it, and then you need, private businesses that should do it. We must make early voting an option for voters who work or study and need flexibility to vote on evenings and weekends, similar to what Hillary Clinton said. I agree with that. We must make no-fault absentee ballots an option for all Americans. Not a big fan of absentee ballots unless they are necessary, and I'm not sure what a no-fault absentee ballot is. Every American over 18 must be registered to vote automatically so that students and working people can make their voices heard at the ballot box. That's, again, Hillary Clinton said the exact same thing on her website. Don't know how you plan on doing it, but I don't like that idea. We already have a woefully underinformed voting population, and by just throwing everybody's names in the voting rolls, it's not going to change that. And half the people that are currently registered to vote don't bother. We must put an end to discriminatory laws and the purging of minority communities' names from voting rolls. Okay, I don't know what discriminatory laws he's talking about and how minority community names are being purged. Are you talking about when people remove dead people from the rolls? Or I honestly, you need more detail here. And how are you going to do this? What laws are you talking about that need to be eliminated? We need to make sure that there are sufficient polling places and poll workers to prevent long lines from forming at the polls anywhere. Again, you're talking about my understanding, and I could be wrong. Please correct me if somebody out there knows that I'm wrong on this. But voting is not done by the federal government. The actual administration or the actual administering of the vote is done by the states. And so I don't think the federal government has any say on whether or not there are sufficient polling places. That's up to each individual state to do. Now let's move on to legal violence. We need to ban prisons for profit, which result in an over-incentive to arrest, jail, and detain in order to keep prison beds full. I kind of disagree with the premise here, because, for-profit prisons, which are just prisons run by private companies, yes, they are paid by the prisoner that they detain, but that does not have a direct impact on arrests and conviction rates, because those prisons aren't the ones arresting people and convicting them. So I don't see how getting rid of prisons for profit would change the incentives to arrest, jail, and detain. The only thing you could possibly argue is that the prisons themselves might be more likely to want to get rid of people that are there. We need to turn back from the failed war on drugs and eliminate mandatory minimums, which result in sentencing disparities between black and white people. I think we need to abandon the war on drugs, not turn back from it. We need to, basically the federal government should not be doing drug policy at all, except for maybe in the cases of smuggling. We need to invest in drug courts and medical and mental health interventions for people with substance abuse problems so they do not end up in prison and they end up in treatment. What the hell is a drug court? Are you saying that if you know someone who smokes pot, you can take them to drug court and then they'll get sentenced to treatment? That's... I don't get that. We need to boost investments for programs that help people who have gone to jail rebuild their lives with education and job training. That sounds wonderful, but what about the people that don't go to jail and don't have job training? Just saying. I'm not saying that the prisoners should be just abandoned, and I do think that we need a better rehabilitation program. And there are programs, particularly some really good private programs that I've been associated with, that specifically go to ex-convicts and teach them skills and get them out there so that they can make a living wage. And I think that's a good thing. But I also think that education is a primary problem before people go to prison the first time. I think that we need, people don't have the skills they need to begin with. And everybody, not just those that are arrested and convicted, need to have those skills. Economic violence. We need to give our children, regardless of their race or income, a fair shot at attending college. That's why all public universities should be made tuition free. Okay, so that's just basically supporting your other policy that college should be tuition free. And putting it under a racial thing. We need to invest $5.5 billion in a federally funded youth program. Okay, this is the third time you've mentioned that. Now you just basically say how this will help people of color in particular. Knowing that black women earn 64 cents on the dollar compared to white men, we should pass federal legislation to establish pay equity for women. Okay. Excuse me. Talking too fast here. Um, I I'm mixed on this because are you talking apples to apples? I understand, if black women, are you averaging all black women that are employed and their wages versus all white men who are employed and their incomes? Because if so, you're not comparing apples to apples. You could be comparing someone who's flipping burgers to someone who's an executive. Uh, you know, Companies should be, and do companies have the right to give merit increases to people that do work particularly well? Those are questions I have for these types of suggestions. We must prevent employers from discriminating against applicants based on criminal history. I disagree with that. I think that depending on the job that you're applying for, your criminal history could be very relevant. If you're someone who has been convicted of embezzlement and I'm looking for a bank teller, chances are, if I find out that you're a convicted embezzler, I'm not going to hire you. Now, it would be completely irrelevant if I was trying to hire you as, say, a construction worker or in a manufacturing plant somewhere. But, I think that employers should be able to know, because we talk about, like with the recent killings of those two reporters on air, they talk a lot about job screening. Well, a criminal history is, yes, an effective tool in making sure that the person is suited for the job. And unfortunately, it makes it tougher for people that have been convicted of crimes. Yes, but that's kind of life. We must prevent employers. We need to ensure access to quality, affordable child care for working families. Which, there goes my text message. But we need to ensure the access quality, affordable child care for working families. Okay, you already said that, and you didn't say how you're going to pay for it. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about fighting for women's rights. And unfortunately, there's good and bad to this section. Not just because I agree or disagree with him, but because he has some specifics, but he's also repeating himself a lot, which I would kind of expect at this point, because a lot of issues people like to put in multiple categories, whether correct or not. And so after his little thing about what the problems are, we go down to, as president, Senator Bernie Sanders' will and his list. Number one, fight for pay equity for women, which he already talked about under the racial thing. And again, same questions, how deep into this are you planning on getting? Are you planning on saying that if I own a business and I have two employees that are both video editors, I have to pay them the exact same wage if they're a man and a woman? Or can I pay one more based on experience? Can I pay one more because they've done more work and I want to give them a raise? Do they have to make the exact same amount of money? And I think that that's a legitimate question, because when you start talking about pay equity, we're really talking about the government dictating payroll. And so I want to know, how far are we going to take that? Expand and protect the reproductive rights of women. Obviously, Sanders is pro-choice. I've already done a whole video on abortion, so I'm not going to get into detail. The only thing is, as I would kind of expect, since he's running on the left, is that he does not say anything about, nor would he, given his position, about the potential rights of the unborn. Instead, it's only about the rights of the mother. And as far as birth control, very few people actually want to get rid of birth control. Number three, only nominate Supreme Court justices who support Roe v. Wade. So now it's getting to where it looks like, to be a Supreme Court nominee under President Sanders, you're going to basically just have to be a card-carrying Democrat, or maybe a socialist, since he's a socialist. That you're going to have to basically agree with all of his major political ideologies to become a Supreme Court justice, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. And this has nothing to do with left, right, or center. I would say this, if same thing, if one of the Republicans, I'm sure at least one of them will, they'd say that, Supreme Court nominations must be willing to overturn Roe v. Wade, I will be just as pissed off about that, because it should not be a political position. Make quality childcare and pre-K available to all Americans. He already said that, and he still does not say how he's going to pay for that. Increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2020. Already talked about that. Raise the tipped minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2023. Related to the minimum wage. And okay, on the whole minimum wage thing, I get that you want to raise the minimum wage. I'm not talking about that particularly, but when you put it under the wage gap between men and women, then I, again, have to ask you, how is this comparing apples to apples? Because if I have two people that are starting in my business at minimum wage, I'm going to pay them minimum wage regardless of their gender. And so I don't understand how raising minimum wage helps reduce the gender gap. I honestly don't. Provide at least 12 weeks of paid family leave, 2 weeks of paid vacation, and 1 week of sick days to American workers. Again, this does not sound like a woman's rights issue. This sounds like a workers' rights issue, but you're throwing it in here because it also benefits women. Expand the WIC program for pregnant mothers and infants. Okay, fine. How are you going to pay for that? Doesn't really say. I don't really have a problem with the WIC program. Make healthcare a right. He already talked about that. And again, how the hell are we going to pay for Medicare for everyone? I have no idea, and he doesn't say. Expand Social Security. It says, as President, Senator Sanders will fight to expand Social Security benefits by an average of $65 a month, increase of cost of living adjustments to keep with rising medical and prescription drug costs, and expand the minimum Social Security benefit to lift seniors out of poverty. Women will benefit the most by expanding Social Security. More than twice as many elderly women lived in poverty than men in 2013. Okay. Great. How are you going to pay for that? Social Security is already, an underwater Ponzi scheme draining money out of the system. How are you going to pay for increasing it? I think that's a serious question that I would want to hear answered by people like Bernie Sanders. Next up is a fair and humane immigration policy. And so I know this is a big deal to a lot of people. Immigration has been all over the headlines, especially since Mr. Trump has been talking a great deal about it. And so let's see what Bernie Sanders wants to do with immigration. After he talks about it a little bit, we get to his 7 points. Number 1, sign comprehensive immigration reform into law to bring over 11 million undocumented workers out of the shadows. We cannot continue to run our economy where millions are made so vulnerable because of their undocumented status. So does that mean you're just going to make them legal, or what? It doesn't say. It just says sign comprehensive immigration reform. That is about as vague as you can get. Oppose trying immigration reform to the building of a border. I'm sorry. I misread there. Oppose tying immigration reform to the building of a border fence. Why? I mean, what's wrong with the fence? Don't get me wrong. You're already spending trillions of dollars, so why not, a few $100 billion on a fence? Sign the DREAM Act into law. Okay, I don't know the DREAM Act, so I can't give detail on that, but at least that's something specific. Expand President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program to include the parents of citizens, parents of legal immigrants, etc. So basically you want to let more and more people be here legally. Authorize and substantially increase funding for Legal Services Corporation to provide legal representation to guest workers who have been abused by their employers. When you say guests, I assume you mean people that are on work visas as opposed to people who are not here legally. And if they're being abused, yeah, sure, they should be, abusers should be prosecuted. Anybody who violates the law should be. Substantially increase prevailing wages that employers are required to pay temporary guest workers. If there is a true labor shortage, employers should be offering higher, not lower wages. Actually, I agree with that. I think that having guest worker visas that have a significantly lower required wage than what you would get by hiring someone who is a citizen is a problem. That's one of the reasons so many companies will get rid of a citizen and bring in a guest worker, because they can pay them less and it's perfectly legal. And so if you increase those wages, then the only reason you would go to a guest worker visa would be because there weren't enough citizens available for the job. So I do actually agree with that one. Rewrite our trade policies to end the race to the bottom and lift the living standards of workers in this country and our trading partners. That is a nice sounding thing, but it says nothing. It doesn't tell me. Rewrite our trade policies to end the race to the bottom. What race to the bottom? Lift our living standards of workers in this country. How? You're not, you know, this is as bad as some of the stuff on Hillary Clinton's website. It does not tell me anything other than let's fix things. So now we have another fairly brief section here on a living wage. I'm sure that you can already imagine where that's going. But let's take a quick peek. He's got just 5 points here. Proposed a national $15 an hour minimum wage. Okay, that's something he's already done, apparently. Led the effort to increase the minimum wage. Okay, that's something he's done. Introduced the Workplace Democracy Act. Again, something he's already done. As the mayor of Burlington, was a strong collaborator with unions. Okay, and leading the fight in the Senate for $15 minimum wage. So basically, there is no real information here except that he likes a $15 an hour minimum wage, and he's done stuff in the past because he likes a $15 minimum wage. Real family values is the next topic. Again, this is a very brief one, and again, he doesn't talk about anything new, only stuff that he's done in the past. That he co-sponsored Senator Kristen Gillibrand's Family Act, which would guarantee him 12 weeks of paid family medical leave. He's talked about that a couple times before. Introduced legislation requiring employees to provide at least 10 days of paid vacation. Talked about that before. Co-sponsored Senator Patty Murray's Healthy Families Act, which would guarantee 7 days of paid sick leave. So again, this is undermining some of the earlier stuff when I was actually going, hey, he's got a plan. He's basically just rehashing stuff he's already done, and I'm a little disappointed by that. But you know, at least that first section really did have a solid plan to it. Here, he's just rehashing stuff that he has done in the past, and that's all he's doing. Unfortunately, this is just like the last one, climate change. He has a very brief section, and his only points are stuff he's already done. It says he introduced the gold standard for climate change legislation with Barbara Boxer to tax carbon and methane emissions. You know, lead the opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, and secured $3.2 billion on the economic stimulus package for grants to reduce greenhouse gas. I understand, you know, a lot of people, particularly Democrats, but a lot of people think that climate change is a genuine, real, world-threatening issue. And if that's the case, you'd think you'd have more than a couple of things you've done that you could put on your resume. I would want to see, what are you going to do? If if this is so important, then that literally could kill us all, why don't you have a 10-point plan on how you're going to combat climate change? Anyone? And finally, we get to the final section of his issues that he lists on his website. And, you know, it's reforming Wall Street. Now, I would expect a socialist to have a lot to say about what to do about Wall Street and the economy in general, which is why I'm really surprised there's not a lot here. And in fact, once again, he talks about stuff he's done in the past, but not so much about what he's going to do in the future. But you can get kind of an idea where he's coming from, at least. And so we start off with the introduce Too Big to Fail, Too Big to Exist Act, which would break up big banks, etc. I know I've talked about this in the past. I don't know that that's the role of the federal government to determine that a business is too big or too successful to even exist. Led the fight in 1999 against repealing the Glass-Steagall provisions, which prevented banks from gambling with customers' money. Has proposed financial transaction tax, which will reduce risky and unproductive high-speed trading and other forms of Wall Street speculation. You know, I know he's a socialist. I know a lot of people think, oh, tax the rich. You know, people that trade on Wall Street aren't all rich people. I mean, I trade on Wall Street. And if you're going to put a tax on every time I buy or sell a stock, that's going to kill me. And it's going to kill a lot of small-time investors. And so I have a problem with that. I have a big problem with that. You know, the answer to everything can't be a new tax. Although you need a lot of new taxes to implement the other programs, so maybe that's why he wants to do that. Co-sponsoring a bill to end Wall Street's practice of paying big bonuses to bank executives. I don't know that, again, the government's role is to determine the size of a bonus that an executive for a company gets. I just don't see that as being a legitimate function of government. And if he wasn't a socialist, I would probably say, gee, that's a little socialist of you. So being a socialist, I can't say I'm all that surprised. But at the same time, I think that's overreaching for the government. Introduced a tax on Wall Street speculation to make public colleges and universities tuition free. So I guess the tax on Wall Street is supposed to pay for his education. Okay. Supports capping credit card interest rates at 15%. Okay. I understand. Credit card interest rates can go through the roof. I know that there are credit cards that charge ridiculous amounts of interest. And mainly because they're high-risk credit cards. People that have a bad credit rating can get a credit card to try and rebuild their credit by getting one of these high interest rate cards. And the idea is, of course, to discourage people from using the credit card as to just let money ride on it, instead pay it off every month, which would be much smarter. And so I don't necessarily think that high interest rates in all cases are a bad thing. Yeah, it's bad if you got to pay for it, but at the same time, the point of that high interest is because these people have done something before that would prevent them from getting a lower interest rate card, and it's a chance for them to rebuild. Sponsor an amendment calling for an audit of the Federal Reserve. Okay, the audit found far more had been spent on Wall Street bailout than previously disclosed, and the considerable funds have been spent to bail out foreign corporations. That still doesn't say how. That's not about reforming Wall Street. That's something you've done, and okay. Warned about the risk of deregulation 8 years before the fiscal crisis of 2008. Once again, that doesn't tell me what you're going to do. It's not a plan. It's not changing anything. It's just saying, hey, you noticed that it was going to be a problem. Has proposed limiting the liability of bankers to get rich. Has proposed limiting the ability of bankers to get rich from taxpayer bailouts of their institutions. Okay, and so that's another thing you've done in the past. And this is, like I said, been an ongoing thing on your website. A lot of this stuff is stuff you've already done, but that doesn't tell me what you're going to do. Don't get me wrong. I'm overall, I think that your website was far superior to Hillary Clinton's. I think that you had a lot more specifics, and I appreciate that. Looking over the issues, I think that your income and wealth inequality section was top-notch, and you had a lot of good stuff in there. The rest of it, not so much. And I think that it's because that's where you want to focus. That's your primary argument, and I think that you do it well. And so I'll tell you what, if I was a Democrat, I would, at this point, now granted we still have a couple more Democrats to go, but at this point I would be riding the Bernie Sanders train, honestly. If I was a liberal Democrat, I can understand why some of my friends who are Democrats are very gung-ho for Sanders. I can completely buy that. My biggest question about his policies is not that I think that what he's asking for is necessarily bad, but unfeasible. How are you going to pay for this stuff? I mean, your universal health care, your universal child care, your free college tuition, all these things sound really, really groovy, but that you're talking about trillions upon trillions of dollars, and in fact you even have a specifically $1 trillion program that you want to institute on top of those. So how are you going to pay for all that? That's my big question. I mean, I understand you say the corporations aren't paying their fair share of taxes, but I don't think they're not paying taxes to the tune of $5 trillion. And so I would very much like to know what your plan of attack for getting the money for this is, and if you can come up with something, hey, you may actually convince me. But right now, I don't see any of this as being feasible. But like I said, to my Democrat friends, I can totally see why you like them. But again, I would ask you, how's that stuff going to get paid for? So that's it for Bernie Sanders. Once again, if you have stuck through this entire video, thank you so much. I want you to be informed. I want to be informed, and that's the goal of these videos. But to prove to me that you have actually stuck through the video, I want you to post a comment today saying that James is a pomegranate. If you post James is a pomegranate, then I will know that you watched this part of the video. And further, I will be covering all the candidates in due time. So, we've gotten the top 2 Democrats. So let's move to the other side of the aisle for the next one and go for the one that everybody seems to like to talk about. Let's talk about Donald Trump. And we'll see you tomorrow for that one. Take care. Oh, but one thing to remember. All this stuff. I've given you the facts. And I proudly proclaim that. I've given you what's on his website just as I gave you what's on Hillary's website. But everything else is just my opinion.